Welcome back, everybody, to the Renaissance Humanism podcast. In today's episode, I will be discussing the rearmament of the Japanese home islands. For people interested in the Far East, Japan's rearmament is one of the biggest news stories to hit the region. It is historically significant for the Japanese, with their pacifist constitution being in force since the end of World War II in 1945. On September the 16th, 2022, Fumio Kishida, the Prime Minister of Japan since 2021, released three new versions of the national security documents focusing on national security, national defense strategy, and national defense program. The papers are the first significant change to Japanese defense policy since 2013. The documents are also the blueprint regarding the threats facing Japan home islands, being described as the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II. One of the fundamental changes they make to the Japanese military budget was move away from the 1% spending of GDP of to 2% of national percent of GDP, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization standard. Currently, as a share of GDP, placed in context, the United States only spends 3.1% of its national GDP, and that is expected to decline to 2.8% by 2033. The current economy of the United States is currently at 26.854 trillion. In comparison, Japan's GDP is 4.4 trillion, and it's the world's third wealthiest nation. Regarding Japan's Pacific rivals, the Chinese government announced defense expenditure is informed annually. In March 2023, China has a yearly defense budget, or RMBS, of 1.35 trillion. That's 224.8 billion US dollars, and one 7.2% increase. They increased their budget by 7.2% increase from a budget of 2022, which was 1.45 trillion, and that was at $229.6 billion. I do apologize for the bit of the pause in just because this is yuan and yuan into United States dollars, and it's a bit confusing. And now I will be discussing why Japan wants to rearm itself. The current president of Japan is pursuing the rearmament and remilitarization of his nation, which is incredibly surprising due to Fukuyama Kishida supporting policies of nuclear disarmament and coming from the peace wing of the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. The three massive geopolitical threats, the survival of the independence of Japan, according to the Japanese government, calling the Chinese the greatest strategic challenge ever to securing the peace and stability of Japan. The other two significant threats to Japan are the North Koreans and Russians. People predominantly in Europe forget that Russia stretches from Eastern Europe all the way to the Japanese archipelago in the Scilly Islands. This belt: S for sugar, A for alpha, K for Kellogg, H for halo, A for alpha, L for Lima, I for India, N for November. The Japanese did not favour remilitarization for two political reasons. The first, they lost the Second World War, and the United States, in retaliation, rather than trying to destroy the Japanese culture and its independence as a people and a nation, the American opted for an option that is truly unique to the Americans, and the strategy to integrate Japan, the Americans were going to try to integrate Japan into the global economy and maintain Japanese identity and enforce a Japanese peace constitution. An essential tenet of the pacifist constitution is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which contains a no war clause. This occurred on May the 3rd, 1947, after World War II. The text of the article of the Japanese government formally announces war as a right of the sovereign and refuses to settle disputes using military force. The second most fundamental reason the Japanese did not maintain a strong military was security provided by the United States during the Pax Americanas. That's from 1945 until 2014, the beginning of the Ukraine war, though some scholars do believe that even now we still live in the Pax Americana, but it is declining. It just depends on your view of history and political events, but that's not something I'll be focusing upon on this episode. Unfortunately, the Japanese, no Americans, are no longer interested in global affairs and being the world's policeman. Since the election of William Call Me Bill Clinton in 1992, American presidents have increasingly been focused on internal American policies. The American public has voted increasingly for isolationist presidents. For Bill Clinton, he was pretty much focused on sex scandals. For George W. Bush, he was focused on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. George W. Bush went against this mold, primarily due to the war in Afghanistan that focused American political and presidential leadership is mainly in that part of the globe, which prevented George W. Bush and his successor Barack Obama and Donald Trump from focusing on the Pacific. It must be stated that it was Donald Trump and his successor Joe Biden that saw American foreign policy move away from Europe continent to the Pacific. Even with the sea change, American Navy has consistently strengthened since the end of the Cold War in 1989 and no longer can secure the world shipping lanes. In 1989, the US Navy, in terms of ships, was 598. It was close to 600 ships, which was the goal of the president at that time, Ronald Reagan. But the Americans never actually got to that number of ships. It was nearly a 600 ship navy. According to the geopolitical analyst, author, and YouTuber Peter Zine, American allies are increasingly having to fend for themselves in a more chaotic and disorganized world order. With the United States becoming increasingly overstretched with the war in Ukraine and USA pulling a naval policy with its destroyers going down to 150 ships and a focus on supercarriers, which are nation killers, they are not practical when it comes to protecting the world's oceans, and that's why Japan must rearm. With this environment, North Korea, China, and Russia have more missile capabilities than the Americans and the Japanese have in that region. The Japanese coastal defense missiles are currently limited to just 200 kilometers. Even in, even the air missile Japan has acquired from Norway are only capable of 480 kilometers. This is not something the Japanese can tolerate any longer, with the Japanese planning to at least have the capacity to launch missiles able to reach targets at least 16,000 kilometers, which is far enough to give the Japanese the capacity to attack Beijing and Pyongyang in retaliation for any strikes from those two nations. The Japanese government that the only reason they would ever use this capacity in a first strike, not a retaliatory strike, would be if they had solid intel that North Korea, China, or Russia was planning to attack Japan or its allies in the Pacific. The opening savers of Japan's rearmament were the purchase of Tomahawk missiles from the USA and a focus on disruptions of similar capacity missiles within the Japanese home islands, with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to produce these items, including the Type 12 missile. Japan government is now moving quickly in a massive missile buying bonanza to become less dependent on international suppliers and other sources outside of Japanese home islands. The website SIPRI say that Japan gets 80% of its missiles currently from the United States of America. Now it's time for the issues with Japanese rearmament. The Japanese plan to rearm has one massive problem. The rearmament program's ability to have population necessary to fight on the battlefield against China, Russia, or even North Korea. Japan's objective to improve the security situation in the region may not be feasible with Japan's declining demographics and its military having a problem filling in 16,000 places that cannot be filled. It doesn't stop ships from still going out of port or other military duties, it just these positions cannot be filled because they're not the people there to fill them. If the Japanese cannot replace personnel, it is doubtful they could automate in time with the projection of the Chinese invading Taiwan within the next 5 years, nor is it possible to increase its birth rate in time. The Japanese birth rate has been below replacement levels since the 1970s, partially due to the oil crisis in the early 1970s, that's 1974 in particular, and the issue in Japan, one's been faced by most developed and industrial nations around the world in regard to low birth rates. The Japanese issues are caused by modern lifestyle, culture, and other factors that cannot be easily fixed, which Japan has been trying to fix for over 3 decades. I'm not sure the Japanese could use immigration. Unfortunately for the Japanese, South Koreans, and China, these are monocities. Unlike their Western counterparts, they don't have the option to bring in immigrants due to protected attitudes to their culture because they're a monocytic culture that's spelled M for motor, O for October, N for November, O for October, T for Tango, O for October, M for November, I for India, C for city, I for India, T for Tango, and Y for yellow. They just don't have the options for that reason. Um, Westerners, particularly people part of the Anglosphere who are English speaking people, may perceive this as racist because if they move to these nations, no matter what they did, they will never be considered Chinese or Japanese. Western countries don't have this attitude towards culture. They have a culture where people can actually mix and become part of society. Still, it was decided politically, culture to move away from monocultures. That's into a multicultural from monotheistic cultures into multicultural societies, which these nations, particularly in the Western world, have, but nations in the Far East don't have. They did this for particular reasons, cultural reasons, to maintain what they perceive as their culture and their civilization. The West, we went through a totally different route. That's why we're able to have high ethnic groups of peoples that are not of traditional French, English, German descent within Western nations. Why for Japan, China, they don't have immigration as options. Furthermore, for the British is a former colonial empire and it has connections in Africa, in the Far East, in Hong Kong, um, even in North America and India and Pakistan. That means that from those former colonial territories, they know the English language, they know the English culture, and that made it can be easier for them to integrate into English, British, and American societies. For Japan, they just don't have the same option. For cultural reasons, political reasons, there's no option for them. Now, for the next part of this podcast, I will be discussing the Chinese internal issues and why this is prompting the Japanese to rearm themselves. The geopolitical analyst, author, and writer Peter Zine predicts that this decade will be China's and Russia's last decade with serious international powers, and he gives two main reasons for this. The first one is a terminal demographic decline in both of these two nations that won't start to recover until the 22nd century. The second reason is that the Russian Federation cannot maintain its multi ethnic empire without a sufficient enough population, and the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, is unlikely to maintain its position as leadership of China. For these two reasons, war with China or Russia is highly possible. With the context of what I'm saying, China is a bigger problem for the Japanese. Chinese Communist Party is facing a perfect storm with the undercounting of its population by at least 100 million, and China is missing 80 million women who were never born due to the impact of China's one-child policy. The one-child policy was implemented by the CCPB and its ideology that allowed for state intervention, state eugenics, and the overall attitude that the state has the right to place actions and interfere within its population's reproduction. Because of these beliefs, the one child policy, which started in 1979, limited Chinese couples to one child due to the fear of mass starvation. The long term impact of this policy 40 years later is that the millions of girls that could have been born are now being aborted due to the desire to continue on the family name in Chinese society that are more favourable towards males. Also, due to China's declining demographic, its country that is getting old before it can get rich, in contrast to its neighbour Japan, which faced the same issue and faced this problem in the 1990s. However, the Japanese managed to reindustrialize, revitalize its economy after it was devastated during World War II, and became wealthy enough to pay for its increasingly aging population. As for China, it has run out of time, with its boomer generation hitting retirement age this decade, and the bulk of them being dead by 2040. And also, retirement age in Japan is actually 60. That just compounds the issue as well. What this means for Chinese Communist Party to survive, even though it most likely will lose any foreign war against the United States and its allies. Um, this is a amoral argument because China, it might lose any foreign war, but there's something to be said for it to actually choose the time and place of its defeat and control the narrative, to control the Chinese national perception of the history. They've already done this once before with the so-called 100 Years of Humiliation from 1837 to 1949. This is where China lost territory to foreign powers, to Russia, to Japan, to the British Empire, and to many others during that time period, and was humiliated repeatedly by foreign nations. But this is fundamentally false as well. It's a half truth. China didn't just decline and collapse due to foreigners. It declined, faced issues, saw the end of China's imperial era due to Chinese internal issues, internal political issues. China's also faced multiple rebellions in that same time period, and some of China, often repeatedly throughout its long and bloody history, breaks away from the North. Chinese history is long, complicated, and the public only tends to get a slimmed down version. Very few people understand the strong ethnic divide between the North and Southern Chinese, according to Gerard Diamond, author of Guns, Steel, and Germs. Because for the Northern Chinese, they tend to be whiter, smaller ears, taller and bigger, in contrast to their Southern counterparts, look more like Vietnamese with larger ears and darker skin tone. I'm not using that as a racist slur in by any means. It just that's what it is. It's what's in the book by Gerard Diamond, Gun, Steel, and Germs. Ethnic characteristics do not dictate a person's ability to perform. I'm just making you aware that there is a ethnic divide within the Han Chinese itself. It's not just that simple, and also that China has repeatedly broken apart and reunited again. Typically, the northern Chinese, after someone breaks away, after it breaks apart, somebody unites northern China, and then that person goes on to cover the other regions within China and to reunite the Han Chinese. For the CCP to survive as well, if they do start a war, according to Peter Zine, this could mean at least 500 million dead, but this could still leave the Chinese Communist Party still in power because they get to choose when the war starts, who they fight, how they will fight, and they'll get to determine what people believe after the event. Because the Chinese, if they get with 500 million dead, or with 500 million Chinese dead, if not more, through famine, through starvation and war, then who are they going to blame? Are they going to blame the foreigners bombing their cities or the leaders of China? And that's where perception is just so important when it comes to politics. Its perception often trumps reality. Hope you found this episode informative and enjoyable. I shall leave my links below, and I wish you all a fantastic evening, and thank you for listening.